This is the first of a three-part lecture series on the incredible, the enigmatic, the completely fascinating culture that is Egypt. We see here a map that gives us a sense of what Egypt looked like in ye olden times. The region was divided up into two areas. We have Lower Egypt, we have Upper Egypt, with Lower Egypt on the top and Upper Egypt on the bottom, which might seem counterintuitive. You'd think upper would be up, lower would be down at the bottom. But the designations actually refer to the direction of the Nile, this large river right here, and the direction that that river flows. Now, the Egyptians viewed the beginning of their political history as the moment when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified. And this was how the ancient Egyptians defined themselves. It's not a modern idea that's imposed by present-day scholars. Now, what's important about this is who unified Upper and Lower Egypt for the first time, and that would be the first pharaoh. This will explain why the king, also known as the pharaoh, was so important to the Egyptians. And this is going to be clear to us as we look at image after image of pharaonic art, not only in the Egypt lectures, but in your readings as well. And in this regard, it also explains an important part of pharaonic ideology that we're going to explore further as we look at artwork depicting the pharaoh. So back to this map. We can see here that the people of Egypt situated their settlements along the Nile. All of these red dots right in here. And this is for an obvious reason, that in the vast expanse of desert that Egypt was, this was the source of life. The water would allow for crops to grow and for thirsty people and domesticated animals to drink. Also, the Nile was an important part of how the Egyptians viewed the world around them. Much of the Egyptian worldview can be described as a duality, and the Nile embodied much of this. The Nile had this regular schedule during which it flooded each year, and this predictability was connected with the concept of order, while chaos ensued when the Nile did not flood, and that was needed. The Nile needed to flood because it deposited rich black silt that helped to fertilize the crops. And even this was viewed as a duality. You have the black land, which they called the Kemet, and that represented fertility. And then the red land, that barren desert beyond, called the Desheret, that represented sterility. So even Egypt itself, we can see, was a duality, not even just in the quality of the land, the black versus the red soil, but even in their regional designations, lower versus upper. Now, this lecture, as I said, is part of a series of lectures on the art history of ancient Egypt. In this lecture, we cover the early history of Egypt, and we'll be looking specifically at painting and sculpture. And in the third lecture, that's when we'll cover the later history. So before we move on with this endeavor, I do want to talk to you a little bit about chronology, how the scholars have organized the passage of time in ancient Egypt. Now, with Egypt, we organize time in a couple of ways, actually. The most specific way is according to dynasties, and you can see those listed here. So each dynasty was constructed according to the lineage of a ruling family. You have someone in power, and that power passes on to their son, and so on and so forth. And then eventually the line will die out, and a new family will come into power, ushering in a new dynasty. And of course, you could have a new family that could come into power by force as well. As you can see here, there were 31 dynasties in Egypt before the fall of Egypt to Rome in the year 31 BC. That's right down in here. So this can be a complicated chronological system to work with because we have 31 divisions here. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to focus on 4 broad historical periods: the early dynastic, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, which is our third lecture. And I am, just for a brief moment, one work of art, going to show you something from the Pre-Dynastic period, which let's take a look at that now. So before we get into early dynastic art, this one earlier image does require some examination by us, because it'll help to kind of explain some of the things that we're going to see in the other Egypt lectures, including this lecture as well. Now, as I mentioned, this dates earlier, the pre-dynastic period. So the pre-dynastic period, pre-dynastic, that means that this work was produced before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And Egypt did exist before then, even if the Egyptians didn't want to define those people as being Egyptians. We do have evidence of settlements as early as 5000 BCE. And paintings here that we see, they indicate, and this is very important, that there's social hierarchy already existing in this region of Africa, well before the establishment of the early dynastic period. So one thing that you're going to encounter, and you're going to encounter this repeatedly, not only in your lecture, but in your reading, is how consistent Egyptian culture was over time, which is great for us because it makes it not as difficult to study. Things are the same in many ways as time passes. And this painting, which is one of the oldest Egyptian works ever found, demonstrates well this point. So this painting was discovered in a tomb, and it's believed to be a depiction of a funerary scene, one that includes people engaged in various activity. You've got animals, and you have these boomerang shapes here that look like boats. The boats appear to be loaded with goods, and considering that this is an image in a tomb, it makes me wonder if this is a processional scene where the deceased and the funerary goods float down a river, probably the Nile. And I point this out because when we get to the Old Kingdom period, we're going to see evidence of such processions. So this painting is suggesting that such Old Kingdom funerary practices, they're actually much older, all the way back in the pre-dynastic period. Now, with the various activities we see depicted, there appears to be agricultural scenes, hunting scenes, and scenes that depict armed conflict between people. Now, there's one scene in particular that we should pay attention to. It's this scene here at the very bottom of the left-hand corner. This is a smiting scene, S-M-I-T-E, to smite, to hit. So you can see the person here, weapon raised up, these people kind of kneeling down, and he's getting ready to smite or hit them. Now, I'm pointing this out because this is something that's going to appear very quickly in some of the earliest known pharaonic imagery. So we can see here then that pharaonic imagery does have a precedent, and that this imagery has an old history, that it's dating back, as I said, to one of the earliest known paintings. Now, it's with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the first pharaoh that we start to see the early dynastic period with Dynasty 1. The artwork we see here is a narrative describing events that lead up to this unification, this political triumph. These events are attributed to an individual named Narmer, who was the founder of the first dynasty. Now, this object is a palette which had a functional use. It would, in this depression that you can see on the center of the right-hand side, you can look in that depression, they would grind black pigment, and then they would put that black pigment underneath their eyes to reflect away the sun. It's kind of like an ancient version of sunglasses. However, considering the size of this, 2 feet 1 inch, and the level of artistry invested in this piece, it's pretty safe to make the case that it was not used for this everyday purpose of grinding pigment, but rather this was likely a ritual object or an artistic documentation of historic events. Although, I think with all the self-congratulating that's going on here, there also could be a touch of historical fiction as well. Now, here's what I see as the most important part of this artwork. This image comes from the first dynasty. It's one of the earliest images of a pharaoh. And what we see in this image is a consistent set of iconography, symbols that are intended to convey power. These symbols are setting a precedent. They will appear in varying combinations in pretty much every image that depicts a pharaoh for the rest of ancient Egyptian history. If you can read the symbols in this piece, which you will be able to do, you can pretty much interpret any piece of Egyptian political art that depicts a pharaoh. Okay, so let's break this down. Let's go through. We're going to start on the left. We're starting with the upper register. Okay, so the register where you have this really large man, and you can recognize already our smiting scene, one that we see has origins in the pre-dynastic period. He has his arm raised with his weapon. He has his captive kneeling submissively, and he's about to bash his head in with a mace. And notice too that this person kneeling, in addition to the two individuals directly below Narmer's feet, that they're pretty much naked. That nudity also is a way to convey that sense of being submissive in addition to kneeling. So there's kind of some dual iconography happening there to let us know that this guy is defeated for sure. Now, another thing that's very important in Egyptian artwork for pharaohs is the headdress. And the Egyptians actually had 10 different headdresses for their pharaohs. And the one that you see here, it's kind of like bowling pin sort of situation, that is the white crown. And it's known as the headjet, and that is the crown of Upper Egypt. So that's something else that's conveying power. Headdresses are a really great clue that someone's powerful. Now, if you move down, you can see this beard. And this actually is a false beard. And that's another important part of the pharaonic collection of symbols. It's a way to convey masculinity. And masculinity is something that has historically, and I even think this is true today, has been used to convey power. Because if you think about stereotypical ideas of masculinity, men are strong, men are powerful, men are aggressive, men are assertive. These are all things that you as a leader would ideally want to be associated with. And so by wearing these trappings of masculinity, it conveys that idea that you embody those concepts as well. We have this skirt that he's wearing here, and the skirt actually is a war kilt. And so this is a way to show his power because he's engaging in war. He's very clearly the leader because we see some hierarchical scale going on. And because we see power being indicated through things like, the headdress, we see that he's this kind of violent individual bashing people's heads in with maces. And so this shows that he's an active member of the military and not just some guy sitting in a tent giving out orders or sitting on a throne in a comfortable palace somewhere. This guy is in the field doing it. Left foot forward. The left foot forward is considered to be an active stance, this idea of moving, of actually doing something. So all the things I just said about getting out there, doing it, leading, being an active ruler, the left foot forward also conveys that idea. Next, we have this sort of interaction here where you have the feet of Narmer directly over these like crumpled up guys. And they look crumpled up because their appendages are kind of like angled in every which way. And they're angled like that to suggest that their bones are broken, that they've been defeated, and it's not too far of a stretch to think, okay, these guys are probably dead. Now what's happening here, this scene is called trampling. Trampoline. Not trampoline like you're jumping, but trampling as in like stomping on somebody. And so that's another way to convey power, to convey dominance. He's walking on the dead bodies of these people. Now, that's it for the typical symbols of pharaonic power on this side. Now, I can just point out a couple things. This is separate, though. This isn't, common images of pharaonic power, but just some more on iconography if you're interested in seeing it. So to the left of Narmer, we have this smaller man holding things. What he's actually holding are sandals. You'll notice that Narmer is barefoot. He's holding Narmer's sandals. And the idea is that Narmer is barefoot, fighting in a war, which seems like that would be dangerous for your feet. He's fighting on holy ground, that this is actually something that the gods have ordained. He's victorious and powerful because the gods have his back. And this is like propaganda 101. We're going to see this in Egypt. We're going to see it in Mesopotamia. We're going to see it. Rome's a pretty big fan of doing this too. This is very, very common. This idea that the gods are behind you in your decisions. Because how can we, mere mortals, argue with that? This is what the gods want. The gods want Narmer to be powerful. We have on the other side of Narmer this falcon. This is Horus, which was believed to be the divine manifestation of the king. So more of that connection to religion and religious power. And what he's doing is he's holding on to this kind of papyrus situation and standing on a lotus flower. Now the lotus flower, that is associated with, or excuse me, it's a papyrus flower. Papyrus flower, and that is associated with Lower Egypt. So you have a reference to Upper Egypt with the headdress. You have a reference to Lower Egypt with the papyrus. But keep in mind that these symbols are being presented separate here. They're in the same composition, but they're not combined. So it's hinting to us that these regions will be unified, but they're not unified yet. So moving on now to the other side. If you start at the top, you should be able to figure out who Narmer is. We've got the headdress. Now this is a different headdress. This is the deshret, which is the red crown of Lower Egypt. And the idea behind the shape of this is it's meant to be like a snake coiling out of a basket, going to attack you. So that's pretty scary. That's pretty intimidating. And that kind of goes in with that, factor of power. I mean, pretty much everything that's in here is working to tell us this guy is kicking butt and he's powerful. And we can see the victory here in that he's marching. He has hierarchical scale again, lesser people in the military. And then to the right, we have bodies with decapitated heads. And so that is showing the defeated enemy. And one of the things that Egypt did is they were very detailed record keepers. One of the things they wanted to keep records of is how many people were killed in battle. And so what would happen is with the deceased people, the defeated enemies, they would decapitate either the head or the penis, and they would throw it in a pile. And then the scribes would come. I feel bad for the people with this job. They would come and they would count the heads, or they'd count the penises, and then that's how they could keep track of how many people were killed. So these decapitated heads here are people that are ready to be counted. And then of course, we can see that maybe there's an additional message, especially if they're cutting off the penis, because that takes off someone's masculinity and it further defeats them even more. You can say the same with the head as well. It's just really a clear way to show that you have been defeated. The middle register, this is two felines with necks entwined, likely a representation of Upper and Lower Egypt. And then here on the bottom, this is Narmer in the guise of a bull. Clear genitalia so that you are not doubting his masculinity. Trampling on some naked guy, while simultaneously breaking down the walls of a city. So just in case with the other four registers, if you didn't get the idea that this guy is powerful and conquering things, that's just one more opportunity to convey that message. Here's another example of Egyptian sculpture. This is from the Old Kingdom period, so we're moving on. And we can see that a lot of what we saw with the palette, we're going to see here again. So let's take a look at the pharaoh. And this might be a good opportunity for you to maybe do a little practicing. You can pause the video and you can see if you can identify what are features of pharaonic iconography that you learned about in the last image that you see here. So hopefully you did that. Let's start at the top. Let's work our way down. So we've got the headdress. And this is a different headdress because, as you know, there were multiple kinds. Egyptian pharaohs could wear what they liked when it suited their fancy. This one, you don't have to write the name down because we'll learn about the name later, is the Nemes headdress. And it's like a head cloth. So he's got his headdress. He's got his fake beard. You can see he has the kilt on as well. And then we also have the left foot forward. Now there's another part of pharaonic iconography here that we need to note that we haven't seen yet, and that is the way the body is treated. 3 things you want to note: stiff, trim, as in like skinny, and muscular. Stiff, trim, muscular. And this is pretty much the standard body type of Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom period pharaohs. And it was an idealizing approach, meaning that this is the perfect body. So it's not that every single pharaoh coincidentally had a body like this. This was how the perfect body was. Obviously, if a pharaoh, you're going to have that, even if in reality you didn't. You want to keep in mind that these are portraits, but they're not meant to give a sense of the individual. Who is this person? What's their psychology? Nobody cares. They are pharaohs, first and foremost. That's their identity. And so these are meant to be images to convey power, and using a very formulaic approach, meaning the same images over and over and over again. They're all going to look like this. Now, this is a sculpture that we call a dyad, which means there's 2 parts to it. This is the king and his queen, okay? Now, let's talk about queenship for a minute. So in Egypt, the pharaohs were highly polygamous, multiple wives, but they had a great wife. Their great wife was the first wife that they marry, and usually that would be someone who they were related to, like a sister, a half-sister, a cousin, even though that's already starting to feel a little far away. Now, we might be thinking, ew, gross, but this was a political strategy. I think even more than a conceptual strategy. So sometimes people say like, oh, they did incest to keep their bloodlines pure. And I'm sure that that's part of it. This idea that like their blood's better than everyone else. They can't, interbreed with like the riffraff. But I think there's more of a political agenda here because it keeps the family unified. If you're married to your sister, very likely you're going to have the same interests. And so she's not going to betray you because your family is her survival as well. In art, usually the queen that you will see depicted will be the great wife, or one of like the high-ranking wives that maybe bore the heir that eventually, takes over after the father passes away. So this queen here is either the great wife, that's who I think it is, or it could be, again, somebody high-ranking. Now, what's unique here is she is high-ranking, expressing a sense of power that's very rare for us to see among Egyptian queens. If you look at this, she's almost presented like an equal. And again, that is really rare. So look at her hair. This is actually a wig. And if you look really close on her forehead, you can see her real hair and then the wig over. That wig looks suspiciously similar to a Nemes headdress. The other thing is there's very little hierarchical scale. She's almost the same exact size as him. She too has the left foot forward. She's depicted in this active stance. And then, this is what blows my mind the most, is look at the positions of the hands. Now, some people have said, okay, this indicates that she's like supporting him, that she's helping him, she's taking a back seat while he is, ruling over the kingdom. But actually, if you think about it, the way her hands are placed, it actually technically puts her in the front, because that's the first part of a body that you would hit if you were looking at this. The hands are in the very front. She's actually ahead of him, which would imply that maybe she was as or more powerful, or that her role was a little bit more active than we think. Now we can see with this dress that her femininity is clearly on display. And this dress is probably not an accurate reflection of Egyptian garments. Most of the garments that Egyptians wore were made of linen, which wasn't like super tight and thin and making every part of your body visible underneath. Her breasts and the pubic triangle clearly articulated. And this was the avenue of power for women in ancient Egypt, was their ability to have children. Because if her husband died and their heir was young, she could rule in his stead until that heir reached maturity. So, we say, oh, there weren't that many female rulers of Egypt. That actually isn't true, because a lot of females ruled Egypt on behalf of young pharaohs who were not old enough yet to rule. So the idea is that there's a clear power here. However, this power needs to be expressed subtly. And this is what we refer to as patriarchal bargaining. This is where women can convey power, but they do so in ways that are cloaked by the status quo, so that it doesn't upset any norms or traditions. It is not a norm or a tradition for a queen to be this powerful. So you have these subtleties, like the foot steps forward, but just a little. Or she wears a wig, but doesn't look exactly like a headdress. Where if you look at this on first glance, oh, okay, it's a king and queen, he's more powerful. But when you start to deconstruct the image, you actually see that the power that's being suggested here is almost equal. Now, something that we're going to talk about further in the next lecture are mortuary chapels. This will be our lecture on architecture. And these mortuary chapels, also known as funerary chapels or temples, they would be placed adjacent to a tomb. Now, in these chapels, there would be representations of the deceased, sculptures known as Ka figures. Ka references the soul. And that's an example that we see here. Now, the best way to explain these is it's a plan B. So, mummification was important to the Egyptians because it preserved the body so that the soul could live on in the afterlife. There needed to be a connection between the physical body and the soul for this to happen. Now, if anything happened to your body, your soul would be in jeopardy in the afterlife. So mummification, right? Again, important, but also very sketchy. What they would do is they would have the mummifier basically cut a slit in the abdomen and just kind of by feel reach up and remove the organs, which were interred in separate vessels, which were called canopic jars. Canopic jars. And so if he's like reaching around there and like rips your lung, you're done. This is why it's really important to get really great people to mummify your body, the best of the best. Or let's say your mummification went off great. You're like the most preserved mummy ever. But somebody robs your tomb. And in that process of having your tomb robbed, your mummy gets damaged. You're done. And so having this Ka figure was a way to make sure that there could still be a connection. This Ka figure represented you. It represented your body. And so the soul could maintain that connection even if something happened to the mummy. Now again, This is an image of a pharaoh, and you should have been able to pick up on that if you looked at the iconography. We have the nemes headdress. We have the beard. And now we know that we can look for the body type: trim, stiff, muscular. Now another thing, we've got the kilt and the throne. On the throne, this is a new symbol we haven't talked about yet. On the throne on the side is what's called simatawi. And what that is it is lotus and papyrus intertwining. Now you know that papyrus represents Lower Egypt. Our lotus represents Upper Egypt. So this is that idea of a symbol showing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, attributing that unification to the pharaoh through this motif of these two flowers combined. We also have here, you can kind of get the idea that there is something behind his head. Our falcon Horus is back, that representation of the king. His wings extend around the head of Khafra as though protecting him to show how important he is. Now there's one other thing I want to talk about, and this has to do with formal analysis. So when we learned about the different visual elements and design principles, we learned about the visual element of mass, actual mass, which this is a sculpture. And then this is an example of a closed form mass. This part of the sculpture is very significant because the whole concept, the most important concept around the Ka figure is permanence. This is your plan B. This is what makes sure your soul stays alive and active in the afterlife. It needs to last forever. And so by having closed form mass, that creates that sense of permanence and sturdiness, the sense that this sculpture will last forever, which is a very appropriate complement to this structure's function. Now let's look at a couple other examples of some sculpture, okay? Now we're looking at two other people, and these were both members of the Egyptian government. And these people are powerful. And we know they're powerful because their sculptures existed. People like you and I, we're not having sculptures made of us. So to even have a sculpture that exists, it lets you know that you're important. But what matters to the pharaoh is that you know that even though these guys are important, that they're not as important as the pharaoh. And so these images of these two individuals, they at the same time convey power, but not too much power. So the fact they exist conveys power. The other thing that conveys power is you can notice that they have a little extra weight in the midsection. And what that indicates is that these men are not laborers. They're not like out working in the field somewhere. And they have these like cushy jobs where they just kind of like sit around. And they also have access to really delicious and tasty foods, which often are the kinds that make us gain weight. So the fact that they have a little extra flesh on their bones is actually a sign of status. Now, the way that though we can know they're not too important, and we would never mistake them for the pharaoh, is through, first of all, the lack of pharaonic iconography. They're not wearing the headdresses, they're not wearing the false beards, and they don't have the body type, the idealizing body type. They're not trim, stiff, and muscular. The other thing is that they actually, if you look at their faces, there is this very clear intent on showing actually who these individuals, what they look like, especially Ka-Aper. I always am taken aback by how realistic this piece is, where our pharaohs, they're shown very generic. This is, for example, Menkaure, who looks pretty similar to, if I can go back, which it won't let me. Okay, it doesn't let me go back. Anyways, previous slide, Khafra. One final thing, let's note material. This is a way also to show that these men are not quite as powerful. You have limestone with the seated scribe. You have wood with Ka-Aper. These are lesser prestigious materials than the stone that was used to create the Menkaure sculpture. Now we're going to look at just a couple more sculptural images from the Middle Kingdom period before we conclude this lecture. Now, looking at a couple, this is not to say that Middle Kingdom artwork was not as plentiful or as important as its earlier Old Kingdom predecessors, but it's more that the New Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom period is really just a continuation of the Old Kingdom period. Much of what I have said about the style and the iconography of the earlier sculptures is applicable to what's being produced in the Middle Kingdom. There is one notable difference, and I will address that on the next slide. But first, I want to tell you that the Egyptians were amazing metal workers, and they made unparalleled jewelry. This is one example of two pectorals, so large chest ornaments, that belonged to the queen Mereret. Now, she was the wife of Senusret III, who we're going to be talking about in the next slide. This jewelry and pieces similar to it were found at her tomb. The point of this jewelry was twofold. So first, with its finely crafted metalworking technique known as cloisonné, which you don't need to write down. We'll learn about that later when we talk about jewelry in the Middle Ages. Anyways, with this technique, on top of the gold, the semi-precious stones, this conveys wealth, and therefore it conveys the power of the queen. Second, iconography. If you look closely, it should be familiar to you. It actually has in it pharaonic iconography. And this is a great opportunity to once again test yourself. Within this dense image, what do you see that is pharaonic? We have smiting. Here's the two men with the red skin, weapons raised, kneeling captives, heads about to get bashed in. You also have the kilt, the left foot forward as well. So when she wore this, what she was doing is that she wasn't only just conveying her own power and wealth, but she was also reinforcing the power of the king as well. We conclude this lecture by looking at an image of a pharaoh. This one was from the later years of the 12th dynasty. This is when the Middle Kingdom period was coming to a close and Egypt was transitioning. It was transitioning into the Second Intermediate period. So it's a time of change, but not a very good one. There were a lot of social changes going on during this time, and particularly these were changes that challenged the power of the pharaoh. And this created civil unrest, it created disorder, and we know that the Egyptians do not like disorder, they do not like chaos. So we have statues like these being made that function to reinforce to the people the power of the king. Now we can see this with, once again, the tried and true iconography. The headdress, which we know is the Nemes headdress. We have this headdress here functioning to really emphasize these overly large ears. Now, I'm not sure what these ears are about. Like, if this person had large ears, or is this iconographic? I'm really not sure. We also have the war kilt, and then the body type, the trim, the stiff, the muscularity. But what's really noteworthy about this statue is its honesty. And it is a rejection of the idealizing style in this way that we saw in Old Kingdom sculpture. Yes, we have the idealized treatment of the body, but look at the face. We have emotion. There's brooding here. He looks upset. Now, maybe this is to show that Senusret III is a sensitive guy, but I doubt that. I think it's to convey that being a pharaoh in the 12th dynasty wasn't all rainbows and purple horseshoes. Now, it wasn't as if Senusret was powerless. He actually was probably the most powerful of the dynasty 12 kings. He created peace treaties. He dealt with the nomarchs, who you'll learn about in your reading. He had successful military and building campaigns. But the point he's trying to tell you here is, despite these successes, it wasn't easy. Now, this is a brief and unique moment in the history of Egyptian sculpture, this concern with capturing the individuality of the pharaoh and expressing emotion. We will see with New Kingdom period sculpture that it's going to go back to the idealizing style, even to more extremes, where details about the actual person behind the office of the pharaoh become even more irrelevant.